Most people spend their lives waiting for a push. They wait for the perfect moment, the right mood, the supportive friend, the inspiring speech, the deadline that forces movement, or the fear that finally makes inaction uncomfortable. But beneath that waiting is a quiet assumption, one that shapes their entire future without them realizing it. They believe something outside them will eventually create the pressure needed to change. A boss will demand more. A teacher will enforce discipline. A family member will remind them. A crisis will wake them up. And so they sit in a dangerous comfort, believing progress will begin when something external arrives. But the truth is brutal and liberating at the same time. No one is coming to push you. Not consistently. Not intentionally. Not with the intensity required to transform your life. People are busy pushing themselves, fighting their own fears, carrying their own responsibilities. Even those who care about you cannot live your discipline. They cannot wake up inside your mind when you choose comfort over growth. They cannot force your attention when distractions feel easier. The moment you understand this, something shifts. Waiting becomes irrational. Complaining becomes pointless. Excuses begin to sound hollow. You realize that every day you remain still, nothing is malfunctioning. The world is simply continuing without forcing you forward. And this is where many people freeze, because they suddenly see that progress is optional. No system is obligated to build your future. No one owes you reminders, pressure, or urgency. Your life is not on autopilot toward growth. It only moves when you move. And the absence of that push isn't unfair. It's freedom disguised as responsibility. The reason people wait for motivation is not laziness. It is psychological protection. The human mind is designed to avoid discomfort, and growth is uncomfortable by nature. When you rely on motivation, you are essentially asking for emotional permission to do something difficult. You want to feel ready before you begin. You want energy before effort. You want certainty before risk. But motivation is unstable because it depends on mood, and mood depends on countless variables you cannot control. Sleep, stress, comparison, fear, and even weather can change your willingness to act. When you depend on motivation, you hand control of your progress to these variables. You become productive only when conditions are favorable. This creates a dangerous loop. You wait to feel motivated, you don't act, progress stalls, guilt increases, confidence decreases, and the next action feels even heavier. Over time, you begin to believe you lack discipline, when in reality you have trained yourself to move only when emotions cooperate. The mind then becomes addicted to external triggers. A deadline creates urgency. A competitor creates pressure. A public commitment creates accountability. Without those forces, you drift. This is why some people perform brilliantly under pressure but struggle when freedom appears. They never learn to generate their own push. They outsourced urgency. And when no one is watching, nothing happens. The harsh realization is that waiting for motivation is not neutral. It slowly weakens your sense of ownership. You start believing productivity requires inspiration. You forget that action can come first. You forget that momentum can create energy. You forget that discipline is not emotional. It is a decision repeated long enough that resistance becomes quieter. Comfort zones are not just habits. They are identity shields. Inside comfort, you don't risk failure, embarrassment, or self-doubt. You remain consistent, predictable, and safe. But comfort has a hidden cost. It removes friction, and friction is what builds strength. When nothing forces you to stretch, your standards slowly lower. You begin accepting average effort. You delay difficult tasks. You negotiate with your own potential. And the mind justifies it by saying you will push harder later. But later rarely arrives, because the brain adapts quickly to ease. What once felt like laziness begins to feel normal. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. The danger is subtle. You are not collapsing. You are just not growing. And stagnation is harder to notice than failure. When you rely on others to push you, you temporarily escape this trap. A coach demands more. A boss sets expectations. A class requires deadlines. But once those structures disappear, you face the raw version of yourself. The version that decides without supervision. This is where self-driven individuals separate from everyone else. They don't wait for pressure. They manufacture it. They set standards that feel uncomfortable. They create deadlines no one else sees. They move before fear disappears. This is not because they enjoy discomfort. It is because they understand something critical. Comfort today creates regret tomorrow. Every time you avoid pushing yourself, you are training your mind to believe effort is negotiable. Over months and years, this belief shapes your identity. You don't become someone who can't push. You become someone who doesn't expect themselves to. And once expectations drop, effort follows. Discipline is often misunderstood as harshness, but it is actually a form of self-respect. When you push yourself without external pressure, you are telling your mind that your goals matter, even when no one else is watching. You are proving that your future deserves effort today. Motivation says, act when you feel inspired. Discipline says, act because it matters. The difference is profound. Motivation negotiates. Discipline decides. Motivation depends on emotion. Discipline creates identity. When you rely on motivation, every task becomes a debate. Should I do it now? Should I wait? Should I start later? This internal conversation drains energy before action even begins. Discipline removes the debate. The decision is already made. You act because that is who you are. This reduces mental friction. It also builds trust within yourself. Each time you follow through without being pushed, you reinforce a powerful belief: I move even when I don't feel like it. That belief changes everything. Confidence stops coming from results and starts coming from consistency. You no longer panic when motivation disappears, because you never depended on it. You no longer need external pressure, because your standards create enough. This is the hidden advantage of self-push. It stabilizes your progress. Your productivity no longer fluctuates wildly. Your growth becomes predictable. And predictability compounds. Small actions repeated daily outperform intense bursts driven by fear. When you push yourself, you are not just completing tasks. You are redesigning your relationship with effort. You stop seeing effort as punishment and start seeing it as alignment with who you want to become. The moment you stop waiting for someone else to push you, you reclaim control over your timeline. You stop postponing your potential. You stop believing that life will automatically demand more from you. Instead, you become the one raising the standard. This shift is uncomfortable at first, because it removes excuses. If no one is responsible for pushing you, then your progress becomes entirely your responsibility. But within that responsibility is power. You can act without permission. You can start without readiness. You can improve without recognition. You don't need a dramatic turning point. You create movement through small acts of self-imposed effort. Wake up when it's easier to sleep. Start when it's easier to scroll. Continue when it's easier to stop. These moments seem insignificant, but they reshape your identity. You become someone who initiates rather than reacts. Someone who pushes rather than waits. Someone who builds pressure internally rather than hoping for it externally. Over time, this self-generated push becomes natural. You stop asking whether you should act. You simply act. And the most powerful part is this: once you learn to push yourself, you are no longer limited by environment. You don't need the perfect conditions. You don't need supervision. You don't need constant encouragement. You carry your own engine. Your growth becomes portable. And in a world where most people are waiting for a push, the person who pushes themselves moves faster, farther, and with far more control over the life they are building. There is a quiet moment that defines the trajectory of your life, and it happens far more often than you realize. It's the moment when you know exactly what you should do, and you don't do it. No one else sees it. There's no audience, no consequences, no immediate loss. It's just you, a choice, and a subtle resistance. You could start the task. You could wake up. You could continue working. But instead, you delay. You tell yourself 5 minutes. You scroll. You negotiate. And in that moment, nothing dramatic happens. The world doesn't punish you. Your phone doesn't warn you. Your future doesn't collapse. That's why it's dangerous. Because the cost is invisible. Each time you avoid pushing yourself, you reinforce a pattern: comfort first, growth later. Your brain learns that resistance leads to retreat. Over time, this becomes automatic. You stop recognizing it as a decision. It feels like personality. You begin saying things like, "I'm not disciplined," or "I work better under pressure," not realizing you trained those tendencies through repetition. The mind doesn't care about your intentions. It records behavior. If you consistently choose ease, your identity adapts to justify it. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Because now you're not just pushing against a task. You're pushing against a version of yourself built from hundreds of small avoidances. This is why self-push matters. It interrupts the pattern. It tells your mind that resistance is not the signal to stop. It's the signal to begin. Procrastination is not simply delay. It is emotional regulation disguised as logic. When you postpone something, you are not avoiding the task itself. You are avoiding the discomfort associated with it. Uncertainty, effort, boredom, fear of doing it poorly, fear of discovering your limits. These emotions create tension, and the brain seeks immediate relief. So it redirects you towards something easier, something rewarding, something that reduces that tension. This is why procrastination feels good in the moment. It works. Your stress drops. Your mood improves. You feel lighter. But this relief is temporary, and your brain doesn't calculate long-term consequences accurately. It prioritizes now. So each time you procrastinate, you reward avoidance. You teach your brain that escaping discomfort is beneficial. Eventually, even small tasks trigger resistance, because your mind expects relief through delay. The irony is that procrastination increases the very discomfort you're trying to avoid. The task doesn't disappear. It grows heavier. Guilt accumulates. Pressure builds. Confidence shrinks. And when you finally act, you're starting from a worse emotional state. Self-driven people understand this loop and break it differently. They don't wait for the discomfort to vanish. They move through it immediately. They start before they feel ready. This short-circuits the procrastination reward system. Instead of feeling relief from avoidance, they feel relief from progress. Their brain begins associating action with emotional improvement. Over time, starting becomes easier. Not because tasks become simpler, but because their mind learns that pushing forward reduces stress more effectively than escaping. Dependency on external pressure often begins early. Deadlines in school, supervision from parents, evaluation from teachers. These structures create urgency for you. You learn to perform when required. You learn to complete tasks because consequences exist. But this system has a flaw. It teaches compliance, not initiative. You become efficient when told what to do, but passive when left alone. When adulthood removes constant supervision, many people feel lost. There are fewer immediate consequences. No one forces you to improve. No one tracks your effort daily. The responsibility becomes internal, and this is where many drift. They continue waiting for pressure that never comes. They miss opportunities not because they lack ability, but because no one demanded action. Self-push replaces this missing structure. It transforms you from reactive to proactive. Instead of waiting for urgency, you create it. You define your own expectations. You set timelines that matter even without enforcement. This is psychologically difficult, because self-imposed rules are easy to break. There's no punishment. Only your own judgment. But that's the point. You begin building internal authority. Your word to yourself starts carrying weight. Each time you follow through, you strengthen that authority. Each time you don't, you weaken it. Eventually, your internal voice becomes either a suggestion or a command. People who push themselves turn it into a command. They don't rely on external discipline because they built internal accountability. And once that exists, freedom stops being dangerous. It becomes powerful. There is another reason people avoid pushing themselves: fear of confronting their real capacity. As long as you don't fully try, you can believe you could have done more. This protects your ego. If you fail without maximum effort, you can blame circumstances. Lack of time, lack of focus, lack of preparation. But if you push fully and still fall short, the result feels more personal. It reveals your current level. Many people unconsciously avoid this clarity. They stay in half-effort mode to preserve possibility. But this comes at a cost. You never see your real potential. You never learn your limits. You remain in uncertainty. Self-push removes that illusion. It forces honesty. When you give full effort, results become information. You see what works, what doesn't, where you need to improve. This accelerates growth. It also reduces anxiety, because uncertainty disappears. You're no longer guessing about your ability. You're measuring it. This is uncomfortable, but it's also empowering. Because once you know where you stand, you can move forward deliberately. Without pushing yourself, you stay trapped in imagined potential. With self-push, you convert potential into progress. You stop protecting your ego and start building competence. And competence is far more stable than confidence based on hope. The most powerful shift happens when pushing yourself stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like alignment. You begin to recognize that every time you choose effort, you are voting for the person you want to become. You are reinforcing identity, not just completing tasks. The early stages are difficult because resistance is loud. Your mind argues, delays, negotiates. But with repetition, something changes. The resistance weakens. The gap between knowing and doing shrinks. Action becomes more automatic. You stop needing emotional momentum. You rely on standards instead. This is when self-push becomes sustainable. You don't feel heroic. You feel consistent. And consistency compounds quietly. Days stack. Skills improve. Confidence stabilizes. You begin to trust yourself. That trust is the real reward. Not motivation, not hype, but reliability. You become someone who does what they decided, even when it's inconvenient. This changes how you approach everything. You no longer ask whether you feel like it. You ask whether it aligns with your goals. And if it does, you act. The world doesn't suddenly become easier. You simply stop waiting for ease. You stop expecting a push from outside. You become the force that moves your life forward, one deliberate decision at a time. There is a hidden illusion that keeps people stagnant for years, and it sounds harmless when it first appears. It says you will push yourself when things become more serious. When the deadline gets, there is a hidden illusion that keeps people stagnant for years, and it sounds harmless when it first appears. It says you will push yourself when things become more serious. When the deadline gets closer, when the opportunity is bigger, when the stakes are higher, when failure becomes unacceptable. Until then, you allow yourself to drift. You operate at half speed, telling yourself you are capable of more, just not now. This illusion feels safe because it preserves belief in your potential. You assume intensity can be switched on whenever necessary. But the truth is that urgency is not a button. It is a habit. The ability to push yourself under pressure is built during moments when pressure doesn't exist. If you spend months choosing comfort, you don't suddenly transform into a disciplined machine when it matters. You carry your habits into the high-stakes moment. Your mind defaults to what it has practiced. This is why many people underperform when opportunities finally arrive. They expect pressure to create discipline, but pressure only reveals discipline. If you haven't trained yourself to act despite resistance, the weight of the moment amplifies hesitation instead of eliminating it. Self-push during ordinary days prepares you for extraordinary ones. It builds the reflex to move forward even when emotions resist. It strengthens your tolerance for effort. It normalizes discomfort. So when the important moment appears, you don't need a dramatic mental shift. You simply continue the behavior you've already practiced. This is why pushing yourself when nothing forces you is so powerful. It rewires your baseline. Another trap that prevents self-push is the belief that consistency requires perfect conditions. People imagine disciplined individuals as those who wake up energized, focused, and clear-minded. They assume productivity depends on feeling aligned. So when their mood dips, they interpret it as a sign to pause. But discipline is most valuable precisely when conditions are imperfect. When you're tired, distracted, uncertain, or unmotivated, that's when pushing yourself changes identity. Anyone can work when everything feels easy. Very few can continue when nothing feels supportive. This is where mental resilience forms. Each time you act despite resistance, you weaken the connection between mood and behavior. You teach your mind that action is not optional. Over time, this creates emotional independence. Your productivity stops fluctuating wildly. You don't collapse on low-energy days. You simply adjust intensity and continue. This prevents the cycle of all-or-nothing thinking. Many people either work intensely or not at all. They wait for perfect focus, then binge effort, then burn out, then stop. Self-driven individuals avoid this by prioritizing continuity. Even small action counts. Even imperfect effort counts. The goal is not heroic output, but maintaining motion. Because motion sustains identity. If you push yourself daily, even at low capacity, you reinforce the belief that you are consistent. And consistency builds momentum. Momentum reduces resistance. Resistance shrinking makes future effort easier. This is the quiet compounding effect of self-push. You're not just finishing tasks. You're stabilizing behavior across emotional states. There is also a psychological comfort in believing someone else will eventually recognize your potential and push you forward. A mentor will appear. A boss will notice you. A friend will hold you accountable. While support is valuable, relying on it is risky. Recognition tends to follow visible effort, not hidden potential. People don't push those who appear passive. They push those already moving. This creates a paradox. You wait for someone to push you, but that push often comes only after you begin pushing yourself. Self-driven behavior signals seriousness. It attracts opportunities. It makes others invest in you because they see you investing in yourself. Without that initial momentum, you remain invisible. Your ability exists, but your actions don't demonstrate it. So no one intervenes. And this reinforces the false belief that no one believes in you. In reality, the world responds to evidence. When you consistently push yourself, you create that evidence. You build credibility. Your work becomes noticeable. People begin trusting your commitment. Opportunities expand. But it starts internally. No one can grant you momentum. They can only accelerate what you already started. This is why waiting for encouragement often delays growth. Encouragement multiplies motion, it doesn't create it. Self-push is the spark. Without it, nothing ignites. With it, even small support becomes powerful. The mind often exaggerates the difficulty of starting, especially when a task feels large or ambiguous. This creates mental friction. You imagine hours of effort, complex decisions, uncertain outcomes. The weight becomes overwhelming, and you avoid it. But once you begin, reality is usually less intimidating than anticipation. The first step reduces uncertainty. Clarity emerges. Momentum builds. This is why pushing yourself to start is often more important than pushing yourself to finish. Starting breaks inertia. It shifts you from thinking to doing. The brain recalibrates. What felt heavy begins to feel manageable. Self-driven individuals use this to their advantage. They don't wait for full readiness. They push through the initial resistance quickly. They know the hardest part is psychological, not practical. This approach also reduces anxiety. Instead of carrying tasks mentally all day, you convert them into progress. The mind relaxes when action replaces rumination. Over time, you learn that starting early reduces emotional load. You stop fearing big tasks because you no longer face them all at once. You chip away consistently. This transforms your relationship with effort. You stop seeing work as overwhelming and start seeing it as incremental. An incremental effort is sustainable. The more you push yourself to begin, the easier continuation becomes. Eventually, pushing yourself becomes less about forcing and more about honoring your own expectations. You begin to feel discomfort not when you work, but when you avoid working. Your standards shift. Delay feels inconsistent with who you are. This is the turning point. Self-push stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like identity. You no longer need reminders. Your internal voice is enough. You don't wait for motivation. You create structure. You don't hope for urgency. You generate it. This transformation is gradual, built through repeated decisions. Each time you push yourself when it would be easier not to, you reinforce a new self-image. You become someone who moves forward deliberately. And once that identity forms, progress accelerates. You're no longer battling yourself constantly. Your actions align with your intentions. Effort becomes natural. Not effortless, but expected. And in that expectation lies freedom. You stop depending on external forces. You stop blaming circumstances. You become the one applying pressure, setting pace, and defining direction. Your life no longer waits for a push. It moves because you push it. Most people underestimate how much their environment shapes their behavior, but they overestimate how much it should control them. They believe productivity depends on being surrounded by motivation, structure, and inspiration. A clean desk, a quiet room, supportive people, perfect timing. And while these things help, they become dangerous when treated as prerequisites. Because life rarely delivers ideal conditions consistently. There will always be noise, interruptions, fatigue, uncertainty. If you only push yourself when everything aligns, you surrender your progress to circumstances. You become reactive. Self-driven individuals reverse this relationship. They treat environment as influence, not authority. They push themselves regardless, then adjust gradually. This builds psychological autonomy. You stop needing perfect settings. You learn to act in imperfect ones. This matters more than most people realize. Because when you can work anywhere, start anytime, and continue despite distractions, your productivity multiplies. You no longer lose entire days because conditions weren't right. You salvage momentum. And momentum, even small, keeps identity intact. The deeper truth is that waiting for the right environment is often disguised avoidance. It sounds reasonable, but it delays action. When you push yourself in imperfect conditions, you eliminate that excuse. You prove that progress doesn't require perfection. Over time, this becomes empowering. You realize that your discipline is portable. It travels with you. Whether you're tired, busy, uncertain, or surrounded by noise, you still move. This independence from environment is one of the strongest forms of self-reliance. It means your growth no longer depends on external stability. It depends on internal commitment. Another silent barrier to pushing yourself is the illusion of future compensation. You tell yourself that today's inaction will be balanced by tomorrow's intensity. You delay now, believing you will make up for it later. But this creates a psychological debt. Every postponed task accumulates pressure. When tomorrow arrives, you're not starting fresh. You're starting overloaded. The mind then resists even more, because the workload feels heavier. This leads to another delay, and the cycle continues. The longer it lasts, the more overwhelming everything becomes. Eventually, you don't just avoid tasks. You avoid thinking about them. This creates chronic stress. Self-push breaks this pattern by prioritizing immediacy. Instead of negotiating with the future, you handle what you can now. This reduces mental clutter. You carry fewer unfinished commitments. Your mind becomes calmer, more focused. There is also a deeper shift. You stop relying on hypothetical future discipline. You stop believing you'll magically become more motivated later. You accept that the only reliable version of you is the one acting today. This honesty is powerful. It removes fantasy and replaces it with action. You stop planning effort and start executing it. Over time, this builds trust in yourself. You know you won't leave everything for later. You know you will address things early. This reduces anxiety, because your mind no longer fears accumulation. You're consistently clearing the path. And this consistency compounds. Small actions prevent large burdens. Pushing yourself today protects your tomorrow. There is also a misconception that pushing yourself requires constant intensity. People imagine discipline as relentless effort, no breaks, no softness, no flexibility. This idea makes self-push feel exhausting before it even begins. But true self-driven behavior is not about maximum output. It is about minimum excuses. It is about showing up, even when energy is low, and doing what is reasonable. Some days, pushing yourself means deep work. Other days, it means small progress. The key is continuity. When you allow flexibility without allowing avoidance, you create sustainable discipline. This prevents burnout. It also removes the fear of starting. If you believe every push requires extreme effort, you will resist often. But if pushing yourself simply means moving forward in any capacity, resistance decreases. You redefine discipline from intensity to reliability. This subtle shift changes everything. You no longer judge days as productive or wasted. You measure them by whether you moved forward. This builds a calmer relationship with growth. You stop chasing dramatic bursts and focus on steady accumulation. Over weeks and months, this approach outperforms inconsistent intensity. You don't collapse after high-effort days. You don't disappear when motivation fades. You remain present. And presence compounds. Each small step reinforces identity. Each consistent action strengthens confidence. Pushing yourself becomes less about forcing and more about maintaining direction. Fear also plays a quiet role in preventing self-push. Not just fear of failure, but fear of change. When you push yourself consistently, you begin evolving. Your standards rise. Your expectations shift. And this threatens your current identity. You may worry about becoming different from those around you. You may fear increased responsibility. You may even fear success, because success removes excuses. As long as you don't push, you can say you haven't tried yet. Once you push and improve, expectations follow. This psychological resistance is subtle. It doesn't say stop. It says slow down. It encourages delay, comfort, familiar patterns. Self-driven individuals recognize this and move anyway. They accept that growth changes them. They accept that pushing themselves will create new challenges. But they also understand that stagnation creates deeper dissatisfaction. Over time, avoiding growth becomes more uncomfortable than pursuing it. This is the turning point. You stop fearing effort and start fearing wasted potential. That fear becomes constructive. It pushes you forward. Instead of worrying about whether you can handle growth, you begin trusting your ability to adapt. Each push proves you can. Each step reduces uncertainty. And slowly, fear transforms from barrier to signal. When something feels uncomfortable, you interpret it as a direction, not a warning. The most powerful effect of pushing yourself is not productivity. It is self-respect. When you repeatedly act in alignment with your goals, you begin seeing yourself differently. You stop doubting your reliability. You stop questioning whether you will follow through. You develop quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative, but stable. This confidence influences everything. You approach challenges with less hesitation. You commit more boldly. You recover faster from setbacks. Because you know you can push yourself again. Self-respect removes dependence on external validation. You don't need others to praise your effort. You see it yourself. You feel it internally. This reduces comparison. You stop measuring your progress against others constantly. You focus on maintaining your own standards. Over time, this creates emotional stability. Your mood becomes less tied to outcomes and more tied to effort. Even when results take time, you remain calm, because you know you are moving forward. And this calm persistence is rare. Many people swing between excitement and discouragement. Self-driven individuals remain steady. They trust the process because they trust themselves. And that trust is built one push at a time. At some point, you begin to notice that the hardest battles are not against time, resources, or opportunity. They are against the quiet voice that suggests you can wait a little longer. It doesn't sound destructive. It sounds reasonable. It tells you you're tired, that you deserve a break, that starting later won't matter, that one day won't change anything. And technically, it's right. One day rarely changes everything. But the pattern of many one days changes everything. This is how potential slowly dissolves. Not through dramatic failure, but through gentle postponement. The danger is that this voice is persuasive because it protects comfort. It frames delay as self-care, hesitation as caution, avoidance as patience. Without awareness, you begin to trust it. You start believing that pushing yourself is unnecessary pressure. But there's a difference between rest and retreat. Rest is intentional recovery followed by continuation. Retreat is avoidance disguised as recovery. Self-driven individuals learn to recognize this difference. They allow themselves to rest when needed, but they don't abandon direction. They return quickly. They don't let comfort stretch indefinitely. This requires honesty. You must admit when you're delaying without reason. You must notice when you're negotiating with yourself. Each time you override that quiet voice and act anyway, you weaken its authority. It doesn't disappear, but it loses influence. Over time, you stop debating every decision. You recognize that the voice advocating delay is often temporary. Action becomes your default response. Another barrier to pushing yourself is the illusion that you need clarity before movement. You want to know exactly what to do, how to do it, and whether it will work. This desire for certainty creates paralysis. You spend time planning, researching, thinking, waiting for the perfect approach. But clarity rarely appears before action. It emerges during action. When you push yourself to begin, even with incomplete understanding, feedback appears. You learn what works. You adjust. You refine. Without this process, you remain stuck in abstraction. Your ideas stay theoretical. Your progress stays imagined. Self-push breaks this loop. It prioritizes movement over perfection. You accept that your first attempts will be imperfect. You allow learning to happen in motion. This reduces fear, because you're no longer trying to get everything right at once. You're simply advancing. Over time, this builds adaptability. You become comfortable navigating uncertainty. You stop needing full confidence before acting. Instead, you develop confidence in your ability to figure things out. This is a critical shift. When you trust your adaptability, you stop delaying. You know you can adjust later. So you push forward now. This removes one of the biggest psychological blocks to self-driven behavior. You no longer wait for perfect plans. You create progress, then improve it. There is also a subtle comfort in being pushed by others. When someone else creates the pressure, you don't carry full responsibility. If things go wrong, you can attribute part of the outcome to them. But when you push yourself, ownership becomes complete. Success and failure both feel more personal. This level of responsibility can feel intimidating. It removes excuses. It exposes your decisions. Many people unconsciously avoid this by waiting for external pressure. It protects them from accountability. But it also limits growth. Self-driven individuals accept full ownership. They understand that responsibility is not a burden, but leverage. When you control your effort, you influence your outcomes more directly. You stop feeling powerless. You stop blaming circumstances. You begin shaping your trajectory deliberately. This sense of agency is powerful. It changes how you approach challenges. Instead of asking who will push you, you ask how you will push yourself. Instead of waiting for conditions, you create them. This mindset transforms passivity into initiative. And initiative compounds. Each self-directed decision strengthens your belief in your ability to influence your life. Over time, this reduces fear. You no longer depend on external structures. You become your own structure. Consistency in pushing yourself also reshapes your perception of difficulty. Tasks that once felt intimidating begin to feel manageable. Not because they changed, but because you changed. Your tolerance for effort increased. Your resistance decreased. You built mental endurance. This is similar to physical training. At first, small challenges feel heavy. But repeated exposure strengthens you. Eventually, what once seemed hard becomes normal. Self-push works the same way. Each time you act despite resistance, you expand your capacity. You become less overwhelmed by effort. You stop exaggerating difficulty. This creates a positive cycle. Because tasks feel more manageable, you delay less. Because you delay less, progress accelerates. Because progress accelerates, confidence grows. And confidence further reduces resistance. This compounding effect transforms your productivity quietly. You don't need dramatic motivation. You rely on accumulated resilience. You trust your ability to handle discomfort. This trust is built through repetition. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be taught theoretically. It must be experienced. And every time you push yourself, you add another layer to that experience. Eventually, pushing yourself becomes an expression of self-leadership. You stop waiting for direction. You define it. You stop needing reminders. You create them internally. You stop hoping someone else will demand more from you. You demand it from yourself. This is where independence truly begins. You are no longer dependent on supervision, deadlines, or external urgency. Your progress becomes self-sustained. You decide when to start, when to continue, when to improve. This autonomy is empowering, but it also requires maturity. You must balance discipline with recovery, ambition with patience. Self-driven individuals learn this balance gradually. They listen to their energy without obeying every fluctuation. They rest without abandoning direction. They push without burning out. This dynamic equilibrium allows long-term growth. You don't collapse after intense periods. You maintain steady momentum. Over time, this stability separates you from those who rely on bursts of motivation. While others fluctuate, you remain consistent. While others wait for a push, you create one. And this quiet self-leadership shapes your life more than any external force ever could. One of the most dangerous beliefs you can hold is that you will become disciplined once life becomes harder. You assume that struggle will force growth, that pressure will automatically sharpen you, that difficulty will transform your habits. But hardship does not create discipline. It exposes your existing patterns. When life becomes harder, you don't suddenly develop focus. You fall back on what you've practiced. If you've practiced avoidance, you avoid more. If you've practiced delay, you delay under stress. If you've practiced pushing yourself, you continue pushing. This is why waiting for the right moment to become disciplined rarely works. The right moment never trains you. It only tests you. Self-driven individuals understand this and treat calm periods as training grounds. They push themselves when the stakes are low so that when the stakes rise, their behavior remains stable. This removes panic. Instead of scrambling under pressure, they rely on familiar habits. The mind prefers familiarity, especially during stress. If effort is familiar, you default to effort. If comfort is familiar, you default to comfort. This is why small, consistent pushes matter more than dramatic bursts. You're not just finishing tasks. You're programming your automatic response. Over time, this programming becomes powerful. You stop relying on emotional strength in difficult moments because your behavior is already conditioned. You act almost automatically. And this automatic self-push is what separates those who perform under pressure from those who collapse. Another reason people avoid pushing themselves is the subtle addiction to potential. Potential feels good because it contains possibility without risk. As long as you haven't fully tried, you can imagine yourself capable of anything. You can believe you're talented, disciplined, capable, just not tested yet. This belief protects your identity. But pushing yourself turns potential into reality, and reality includes limits. You might discover weaknesses. You might see slower progress than expected. You might confront the gap between who you want to be and who you are. Many people unconsciously avoid this confrontation. They remain in the comfort of, "I could if I tried." But this comfort is deceptive. It freezes growth. You never develop skill. You never build resilience. You never replace imagination with competence. Self-push breaks this illusion. It forces you into action. You trade imagined ability for real progress. This is uncomfortable, but also liberating. Because once you accept your starting point, improvement becomes tangible. You stop pretending and start building. Each push reveals information. You see what needs work. You adjust. You improve. Over time, competence replaces uncertainty. You no longer rely on potential to feel confident. You rely on experience. And experience is earned only through effort. There is also a quiet tendency to overestimate how much time you have. You assume you can start later, improve later, push later. This creates a false sense of security. Days feel abundant. Delays feel harmless. But time compounds just like effort does. Each postponed day is not neutral. It is a missed opportunity for growth. Skills you could have developed remain undeveloped. Habits you could have strengthened remain weak. Confidence you could have built remains fragile. The cost accumulates invisibly. Years pass, and the gap between where you are and where you want it to be widens. This realization can be painful. But it also creates urgency. Self-driven individuals internalize the value of time. They understand that pushing themselves today shortens the distance to their goals. They don't rely on bursts of future effort. They invest consistently. This approach removes regret. Even when progress is slow, they know they are moving. They don't look back wondering what could have happened. They see evidence of effort. This builds peace. You stop fearing wasted potential because you're actively using it. The awareness of time does not create panic. It creates intention. You become more deliberate with your choices. You push yourself not out of fear, but out of respect for the limited opportunities you have. Pushing yourself also changes how you experience difficulty. Instead of viewing challenges as interruptions, you begin seeing them as part of the process. When you're used to comfort, any obstacle feels frustrating. It disrupts your flow. It tests your patience. But when you regularly push yourself, difficulty becomes expected. You stop interpreting resistance as a sign to stop. You interpret it as evidence you're growing. This reframing is powerful. It reduces emotional swings. You don't become discouraged when things get hard. You become engaged. You lean in. This mindset turns effort into exploration. You become curious about your limits. You test them. You expand them. Over time, your tolerance for challenge increases. Tasks that once drained you become manageable. You recover faster. You adapt quicker. This resilience is not built through theory. It is built through repeated self-push. Each time you continue despite discomfort, you strengthen your mental endurance. And endurance compounds. You become someone who can handle sustained effort. This capacity gives you an advantage in any domain. You can outlast distractions, setbacks, and slow progress. You remain steady while others fluctuate. Ultimately, pushing yourself becomes an act of personal leadership. You stop waiting for instructions. You define your own standards. You stop hoping someone else will hold you accountable. You hold yourself accountable. This shift transforms your relationship with responsibility. It no longer feels imposed. It feels chosen. You decide the level of effort you expect from yourself. You decide how quickly you recover from setbacks. You decide whether you continue when motivation fades. This autonomy builds confidence. You no longer feel dependent on external forces. You trust your own discipline. You trust your consistency. And this trust shapes your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who moves forward deliberately. Someone who doesn't wait for a push. Someone who creates momentum internally. Over time, this identity stabilizes your behavior. You don't need constant reminders. You act automatically. And that is the ultimate power of self-push. It turns effort into habit, habit into identity, and identity into a life directed by your own standards. There comes a stage where you realize that waiting for the perfect emotional state is just another form of avoidance. You tell yourself you'll push harder when you feel confident, when you feel focused, when you feel energized. But emotions are unpredictable. They rise and fall without warning. If your effort depends on them, your progress becomes unstable. Some days you move fast. Other days you stop completely. This inconsistency creates frustration. You begin doubting your discipline, not realizing the real problem is dependency on mood. Self-driven individuals separate action from emotion. They don't ignore how they feel, but they don't obey it blindly either. They understand that feelings are temporary signals, not commands. When you push yourself despite low motivation, you weaken the control emotions have over your behavior. This builds emotional independence. You stop needing to feel ready. You act because the action matters. Over time, something surprising happens. Your emotions begin to follow your behavior instead of controlling it. After starting, energy increases. After progress, confidence rises. After consistency, motivation stabilizes. You realize that waiting to feel good before acting was backwards. Acting is what creates better feelings. This reversal is powerful. It frees you from the cycle of waiting. You don't need inspiration. You create it through movement. And once you internalize this, hesitation loses its power. You know that pushing yourself, even in low states, will shift your mindset. Another hidden obstacle is the belief that small efforts don't matter. When people think of pushing themselves, they imagine dramatic changes. Long hours, intense focus, major breakthroughs. When they can't deliver that level of effort, they do nothing. This all-or-nothing thinking destroys consistency. It turns discipline into a rare event instead of a daily practice. Self-push is not about magnitude. It's about frequency. A small step taken today keeps momentum alive. It reinforces identity. It prevents stagnation. The brain responds strongly to repetition. When you push yourself in small ways regularly, you normalize effort. You reduce resistance. You build a rhythm. This rhythm makes larger efforts easier when needed. Without it, every big push feels overwhelming. You're starting from zero each time. But with consistent small pushes, you're never starting from zero. You're already in motion. This is why disciplined individuals rarely rely on extreme bursts. They focus on maintaining continuity. Even 10 minutes of focused work, even one deliberate improvement, even one uncomfortable decision counts. These actions accumulate. Over weeks, they create visible change. More importantly, they reshape your self-image. You stop seeing yourself as inconsistent. You see yourself as reliable. And reliability builds confidence. You trust that you will continue, even when progress feels slow. There is also a subtle comfort in believing that external pressure produces your best work. Many people say they perform well only when deadlines approach. They assume urgency unlocks their potential. But this habit is fragile. It trains you to delay until stress forces action. Over time, this increases anxiety. Every task becomes a last-minute rush. You sacrifice quality, clarity, and calm. Self-push eliminates this dependency. Instead of waiting for deadlines, you create early momentum. You reduce pressure gradually. This changes your experience of work. You move from reactive panic to proactive control. The task no longer feels like a looming threat. It becomes a manageable process. This also improves your thinking. When you're not rushed, you make better decisions. You refine ideas. You correct mistakes early. Your output improves. More importantly, your stress decreases. You're no longer relying on adrenaline to perform. You rely on consistency. This is sustainable. It protects your energy. It also builds confidence. You know you won't leave everything to the last moment. You trust your own pacing. And that trust reduces mental noise. You can focus fully on execution instead of worrying about time. Fear of imperfection also prevents self-push. You hesitate because you want your effort to be flawless. You want the first attempt to reflect your ideal standard. This pressure creates delay. You overthink. You postpone starting. But perfection is not the starting point. It is the result of iteration. When you push yourself to act imperfectly, you create material to improve. You move from imagination to reality. Each attempt teaches you something. Each correction refines your skill. Without this process, you remain stuck in planning. Self-driven individuals accept imperfect action. They prioritize progress over precision. This reduces fear. They don't expect immediate excellence. They expect gradual improvement. This mindset encourages frequent pushing. You're not waiting to be ready. You're ready to learn. Over time, quality improves naturally. Because you've produced more, tested more, adjusted more. The path to mastery is paved with imperfect effort. And self-push ensures you keep walking it. Eventually, pushing yourself becomes less about forcing effort and more about honoring your own commitments. You begin to respect your goals enough to act on them. You stop negotiating with yourself constantly. You decide, and then you move. This creates internal stability. Your actions align with your intentions. You don't experience the tension of knowing what to do and not doing it. That tension disappears. In its place comes clarity. You wake up and begin. You face resistance and continue. You feel tired and adjust, not stop. This rhythm becomes natural. You're no longer relying on external pushes, motivational spikes, or emotional highs. You are self-propelled. And this self-propulsion changes everything. Progress becomes steady. Confidence becomes quiet and durable. You trust yourself not because you feel strong, but because you consistently act. And when you trust your own discipline, you stop waiting for someone else to push you. You become the force that keeps moving, regardless of mood, pressure, or circumstance. There is a moment that repeats itself in different forms throughout your life. It's the moment when you could choose effort, but no one would know if you didn't. No one is watching. No one is expecting. No one will question you. You can delay, and nothing immediate happens. This is where self-driven people are built. Not in public achievements, but in private decisions. When you push yourself in those invisible moments, you create integrity between who you say you are and how you behave. When you don't, that gap widens. You begin telling yourself you'll do more, but your actions don't follow. Over time, this disconnect weakens your confidence. You stop trusting your own intentions. You set goals, but part of you doubts you'll pursue them. This internal doubt is not created by failure. It's created by inconsistency. Each time you avoid pushing yourself, you send a message to your mind that your commitments are optional. Each time you follow through, you send the opposite message. This internal communication shapes your identity. You either become someone who honors decisions or someone who negotiates them away. The difference is not talent or intelligence. It's the accumulation of small private pushes. And these moments matter because they require no external pressure. They are pure expressions of self-leadership. When you push yourself here, you prove that your standards exist even without supervision. That proof becomes powerful. It builds quiet confidence. You no longer need others to validate your discipline. You see it in your own behavior. Another reason pushing yourself feels difficult is because the brain prefers familiarity over improvement. Even when you want to grow, part of you resists change. Growth requires new habits, new effort, new discomfort. Familiar patterns feel safer. They demand less energy. So the mind subtly pulls you back to what you've always done. This resistance is not weakness. It is biology. The brain conserves energy by repeating known behaviors. But self-push interrupts this automatic tendency. Each time you choose effort over familiarity, you teach your brain that change is acceptable. At first, resistance is strong. The new behavior feels unnatural. But repetition reduces this friction. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. Effort becomes routine. This is how discipline forms. Not through sudden transformation, but through repeated self-push until the new pattern stabilizes. Over time, you stop feeling like you're forcing yourself. You simply follow the routine you built. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity creates temporary change. Consistency rewires identity. When you push yourself regularly, you shift your baseline. What once required effort becomes automatic. This reduces mental strain. You don't debate whether to act. You act because it's normal. And once effort becomes normal, growth accelerates without constant struggle. There is also a subtle psychological trap in comparing your progress to others. When you see someone moving faster, you may feel discouraged. When you see someone slower, you may feel comfortable. Both reactions distract from self-push. Comparison shifts your focus outward. You begin measuring effort relative to others instead of relative to your potential. This weakens internal standards. You push only when you feel behind. You relax when you feel ahead. Self-driven individuals avoid this trap. They measure consistency, not competition. They ask whether they pushed themselves today, regardless of others. This keeps momentum stable. It removes emotional swings caused by comparison. You no longer depend on external benchmarks. Your progress becomes personal. This also reduces procrastination. You're not waiting to see what others do. You're acting based on your own expectations. Over time, this independence strengthens discipline. You become less reactive. You stop chasing validation. You focus on execution. And execution compounds. While others fluctuate based on comparison, you remain steady. This steadiness creates long-term advantage. Pushing yourself also reshapes your tolerance for discomfort. At first, effort feels heavy. Resistance feels loud. You're tempted to stop quickly. But when you continue despite that feeling, something changes. You realize discomfort is temporary. It peaks, then fades. The task becomes easier once you're engaged. This experience reduces fear of future effort. You stop exaggerating difficulty. You know you can handle it. This builds resilience. You become less sensitive to resistance. Instead of retreating, you move forward. Over time, your threshold increases. What once felt challenging becomes normal. You require less emotional energy to act. This is why self-push compounds. Each push strengthens your capacity for the next one. Eventually, you're able to sustain effort longer, recover faster, and maintain focus despite distractions. This endurance becomes a major advantage. You don't rely on bursts of motivation. You rely on developed tolerance. And tolerance is built only through repeated exposure to discomfort. Ultimately, pushing yourself is an act of ownership. You stop waiting for circumstances to shape your life. You take responsibility for direction. You decide when to begin, when to continue, when to improve. This level of ownership transforms your mindset. You no longer see yourself as someone hoping for change. You see yourself as someone creating it. This shift is empowering. It reduces helplessness. It increases initiative. You begin acting sooner, adjusting faster, and persisting longer. Your growth becomes intentional. You're not drifting. You're steering. And the more you push yourself, the more confident you become in that role. You trust your ability to move forward even without support. You trust your consistency. You trust your discipline. This trust becomes the foundation of long-term progress. Because once you rely on yourself to push forward, you are no longer limited by external pressure. You become self-propelled, and that changes the trajectory of everything you build. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop expecting life to force you forward. You begin to see how much of your progress has always been optional. No one required you to improve your skills. No one demanded you strengthen your habits. No one insisted you wake earlier, focus longer, or think deeper. These choices were always yours, and for a long time, you may have treated them casually. You assumed urgency would appear later. But once you understand that nothing is obligated to push you, you start approaching your days differently. You become more intentional. You stop drifting into comfort without noticing. You catch yourself delaying. You recognize when you're negotiating with effort. This awareness is the first stage of self-push. You begin interrupting automatic avoidance. Instead of saying you'll start later, you start now. Instead of waiting for motivation, you create motion. These small interruptions compound. They reshape your routine. Over time, you no longer rely on reminders. Your default becomes action. This shift feels subtle, but it changes everything. You stop living reactively. You stop hoping circumstances will push you. You become proactive. And proactivity builds momentum. Each deliberate push reinforces your control over direction. You're no longer drifting. You're steering. And the more you steer, the more confident you become in your ability to shape your own trajectory. Another important realization is that pushing yourself is not about eliminating resistance. Resistance never fully disappears. Even disciplined individuals feel hesitation. They feel the urge to delay. The difference is not the absence of resistance, but the response to it. Self-driven people treat resistance as background noise. They don't interpret it as a stop signal. They recognize it as part of the process. When you push yourself despite resistance, you weaken its authority. You prove that discomfort doesn't dictate your behavior. This builds psychological strength. You become less reactive. Instead of debating whether to act, you act and let resistance fade naturally. Over time, the intensity of resistance decreases. Your brain learns that hesitation doesn't lead to retreat. It leads to continuation. This rewiring reduces procrastination. You stop fearing the feeling of resistance. You know it's temporary. You know it fades once you begin. This knowledge makes pushing yourself easier. You don't wait for the perfect mindset. You create it through action. And this creates a powerful cycle. Action reduces resistance. Reduced resistance encourages more action. Momentum builds. Consistency stabilizes. Eventually, pushing yourself feels less like forcing and more like following your standard. There is also a deeper emotional benefit to self-push. When you consistently act on your goals, you reduce internal conflict. Many people experience tension between what they want and what they do. They set intentions, but their behavior doesn't match. This creates guilt. It drains mental energy. You constantly remind yourself of unfinished tasks. You carry the weight of delay. But when you push yourself regularly, this tension decreases. Your actions align with your intentions. You stop carrying mental clutter. You feel lighter. Even if progress is slow, you know you're moving. This clarity improves focus. You're not distracted by regret or avoidance. You're engaged in execution. Over time, this alignment builds calm confidence. You trust your decisions because you follow through. You stop doubting your discipline. This trust becomes a powerful motivator. You no longer push yourself out of fear. You push yourself because it feels natural to honor your commitments. This internal harmony is rare. It allows you to work without constant emotional friction. Another shift occurs in how you perceive time. When you rely on external pushes, you often delay until urgency forces you. This compresses effort into short bursts. You feel rushed. You sacrifice quality. You experience stress. Self-push changes this rhythm. You start earlier. You spread effort. You reduce pressure gradually. This creates a calmer pace. You think more clearly. You refine more carefully. You avoid last-minute panic. Over time, this approach improves both performance and well-being. You're no longer living in cycles of delay and urgency. You maintain steady progress. This steadiness builds confidence. You know you won't leave everything for later. You trust your pacing. This reduces anxiety about the future. You're already preparing. And preparation compounds. Each early push shortens the distance to your goals. You don't need dramatic effort later. You rely on accumulated work. This makes growth sustainable. Ultimately, pushing yourself becomes an expression of self-trust. You stop waiting for someone else to believe in you enough to push you. You believe in your own potential enough to act. You don't need external pressure to move. You create your own. You don't rely on motivation to start. You rely on commitment. This independence transforms your mindset. You stop seeing discipline as something imposed. You see it as something chosen. You choose effort because you respect your goals. You choose consistency because you value your future. Over time, this choice becomes identity. You become someone who moves forward deliberately. Someone who doesn't wait. Someone who pushes. And once that identity forms, progress becomes inevitable. There is a point where you realize that no one else experiences the consequences of your inaction the way you do. Others may notice your potential, they may encourage you, they may even remind you, but they do not live inside the slow erosion that happens when you repeatedly avoid pushing yourself. They do not feel the quiet frustration of knowing you could have done more. They do not carry the weight of unfinished goals, delayed progress, and untested ability. This is why self-push is deeply personal. It is not about proving anything to others. It is about protecting your own sense of possibility. Every time you choose effort, you preserve belief in your future. Every time you delay, that belief weakens slightly. Over time, this internal shift becomes noticeable. You either feel capable and in motion, or stagnant and uncertain. No one else can repair that feeling for you. Encouragement helps, but it cannot replace action. Only you can close the gap between intention and execution. And once you accept this, waiting stops making sense. You realize that pushing yourself is not optional if you want to maintain confidence. It is the mechanism that keeps your self-image aligned with your goals. Without it, you drift into doubt. With it, you move into clarity. Transformation occurs when you begin trusting the process of effort instead of chasing immediate results. Many people hesitate to push themselves because progress seems slow. They want visible change quickly. When it doesn't appear, motivation fades. But growth often happens beneath the surface first. Skills improve gradually. Habits stabilize quietly. Confidence strengthens subtly. These changes are not always obvious day to day, but they compound over time. Self-driven individuals understand this and continue pushing even when results lag. They focus on consistency rather than immediate reward. This patience is powerful. It prevents discouragement. You stop interpreting slow progress as failure. You see it as accumulation. Each push becomes an investment. Over weeks and months, the return becomes visible. What once felt difficult becomes easier. What once seemed distant becomes attainable. This delayed gratification builds resilience. You no longer need instant feedback to continue. You trust that effort will compound. This trust removes hesitation. You push yourself because you know the process works, even if results take time. Pushing yourself also changes how you interpret setbacks. When you rely on external pressure, failure often stops you. You lose momentum. You wait for another push. But when you generate your own drive, setbacks become temporary. You don't need someone else to restart you. You restart yourself. This ability is crucial. Progress is never perfectly linear. There will be mistakes, delays, unexpected challenges. Without self-push, these moments can create long pauses. With self-push, recovery is faster. You acknowledge the setback, adjust, and continue. This reduces fear of failure. You know that even if something goes wrong, you won't stay stuck. You trust your ability to resume effort. This confidence encourages experimentation. You're willing to try, learn, and adapt. Over time, this flexibility accelerates growth. You're not paralyzed by the possibility of mistakes. You see them as part of the process. And because you push yourself consistently, setbacks lose their power. They become small detours instead of stopping points. There is also a deeper shift in how you value discipline. At first, pushing yourself feels like restriction. It feels like denying comfort. But over time, you begin to see discipline as freedom. When you push yourself regularly, you reduce chaos. You stay ahead of responsibilities. You avoid last-minute stress. You build competence. These outcomes create space. You have more control over your schedule, more confidence in your abilities, and less anxiety about unfinished work. This is the paradox of discipline. By choosing effort now, you create ease later. By pushing yourself early, you prevent pressure later. Self-driven individuals experience this repeatedly. They see how consistency simplifies life. This reinforces their commitment. Discipline stops feeling forced. It becomes preferred. You choose it because it improves your experience. And once you associate self-push with freedom rather than restriction, resistance decreases further. You're no longer battling yourself. You're aligning with what makes your life smoother and more intentional. Eventually, pushing yourself becomes part of how you define who you are. You don't see it as something you occasionally do. You see it as something you embody. You wake up expecting to move forward. You encounter resistance and continue. You face uncertainty and act anyway. This identity stabilizes your behavior. You don't rely on external motivation. You don't need someone else to create urgency. You generate it internally. And this internal engine keeps running regardless of circumstances. While others wait for a push, you create one. While others fluctuate, you remain steady. This steadiness compounds over time. It shapes your skills, your confidence, and your opportunities. Most importantly, it shapes your relationship with yourself. You trust your ability to follow through. You respect your own commitments. And that self-respect becomes the foundation of everything you build.